what's being proposed by the House leadership just isn't enough. I know they mean well, and I know they're good people. I know some of them. The problem is that if you do President Obama's freezes, you add $3.8 trillion of debt over 5 years. The problem with the Republican plan in the House is if you adopt their plan, because they're only addressing a narrow part of the budget, you add $3 trillion to the debt over 5 years. So it just isn't enough. I'm afraid of what happens over the next 5 years as we accumulate such enormous debt.
Everybody talks about how painful these cuts will be, but what happens if trillion-dollar size cuts aren't made?
Right. Well, see, I think the interesting thing is people talk about pain, but it sort of goes both ways. If you shrink the government sector and you're in the government sector, there's pain, but the private sector expands. My goal is to have less money in Washington and more money in private businesses and corporations and individuals' hands. So there you see an expansion of the private sector. It's not a zero-sum game. It's like all of a sudden you lose this. You're going to gain a lot. And then you also can argue that money is better spent, more efficient use of dollars, more profit and more wealth is created by the private sector than the public sector.
But just to finish that, the doomsday scenario, if we don't do something, if we don't get rid of it.
I think it's out there. I mean, we had a presentation this week where some very smart people who look at sovereign debt and have looked at Greece and have looked at the countries Portugal and Spain, they say Japan has already passed the point of no return. Now, it's a prediction. They could be wrong, but they say they have. They say we're a year or two behind Japan. And so I think it's a very serious problem. We have to do something about it.
Kevin Glass with townhall.com. How receptive or icy has the entrenched Senate GOP leadership been to some of the things that you've been proposing and talking about since you've gotten on the Hill?
Well, I think actually everybody's been pretty nice to me. Nobody's uninvited me to any lunches or things. I think what I would say is that in general they all agree. When we're around the conference and we talk about this and that, we all agree it's just a matter of how big the cuts and how rapidly you can do it. So some think that incrementalism can do it. But here's the problem. For example, there is a proposal on the Republican side that may come out that talks about capping spending at 20.6% of GDP. But getting there over 10 years, and the problem is we only bring in historically 18%. So to me, it's not very bold to say in 10 years we'll still have a deficit. I mean, at the very least, whatever plan you're proposing ought to, at the very end, balance the budget. But their plan in 10 years would still probably have $200 or $300 billion deficit for that year.
And what do you think of Bernanke's recent comments on saying financial disaster is going to come if we don't raise the debt ceiling?
What I would say is that there are ways of continuing to pay your debt without raising the debt ceiling. For example, we bring in $200 billion a month, $200 billion a month in taxes. There's a bill by Senator Toomey that would say, out of the $200 billion we bring in taxes, let's send the first portion of that, the priority of the tax receipts, to pay the interest on the debt. There's plenty of money every month to pay the interest on the debt. So there's no reason to ever default. It's set up as a straw man. It's set up as an either-or argument to say, either you raise the debt ceiling or the sky will fall. To show you that that may not be an honest assessment, look at the words of President Obama, who was then Senator Obama, when he voted against raising the debt ceiling in 2006, and he said that it was an example of poor leadership, and he didn't think he could vote to continue leadership that was going to treat the spending and the deficit this way.
What do you think the plausibility is of getting some, at least on track for some serious spending cuts tied to the debt ceiling vote?
That's what I'm shooting for, and that's what I'm pushing for. And I've been talking with House freshmen who I think are very receptive to it. I think the more recently you got to Washington, the more receptive you are to bigger cuts. But also, we've been out there talking to the voters. We know that the voters are ready. We know the voters can accept it and will accept it. And really, in fact, many of the voters won't accept anything less from us. They'll bring us back home if we're not bold, because that's what they want.
I'm sorry. Do you want to do more?
Well, final question. With the retirement of Kay Bailey Hutchison, are we going to see a Paul Senate team?
I don't know. You have to ask the other Paul that question.
You talked in your speech, this is Brian Montalvo from CBS News. You talked in your speech about not getting co-opted. How do senators and members of the House get co-opted when they get to Washington? I mean, you've had some time there now. You've gotten to see how it works. How do they get co-opted? Talk about how that happens and what they need to do to resist that.
Well, I think it's that people will say things like it's never been done that way, or it's always been done this way, or we can't get any Democrats to vote for it, But it's sort of a self-defeating proposal if you start out with, we're going to capitulate in the beginning. For example, I proposed $500 billion in cuts, but I'm realistic enough to know I may not get my 500, but if I propose 100, I might get 50. So if I propose 500, the middle is much closer to what we actually need. And we do need more because really, to put things in perspective, we called our $500 billion cut a modest proposal, really with the intention of pointing out that it really is literally only a third of 1 year's deficit. I mean, it is a modest proposal, but to people around here, it's incredibly dramatic. But it's a matter of perspective, and it's a matter of how hard you want to look, but it's also a matter of deciding, can some things be done at the state and local level that we have thought for at least the last 10 or 20 years have to be done in Washington.
Have you had experience with special interests thus far that have sort of made you feel like you've seen the dark side of Washington?
No, in fact, because I've been fairly outspoken during my campaign and here, I think I'll get less pressure from special interest in that sense. But I will tell you a story that I really like. And I met with a president of a university a couple weeks before the election. I think he assumed I was going to win. And I met with him, and his job is to advocate for money. That's what presidents of universities do. But he sat down with me and he showed me a list of the earmarks that he had gotten from other senators. And he said, I know you're not going to do earmarks, and you made this promise, and I understand that. I just want to show you what our needs are. But you know what? Ultimately, I'm an American first. And it's my job to advocate for money for my university, but I realize the country's hurting. So I think people understand that and are willing to work through what it's going to take. But really, you have to think of the alternative. Everybody always wants to talk about, oh, you're going to cut this. The alternative may be chaos if we don't get our debt under control. And if you don't look at what the alternative is and you spend all your time saying, well, this person's not going to get this check they always got, then you never see the other side of it. There's a disaster that I think looms if we do nothing.
One more question. Do you think there is a risk to you, and I know you're not thinking about being reelected, but to any politician who's advocating cutting some of these things that maybe special interests want? You talk, some members of Congress say we have to spend 4 hours a day on the phone fundraising.
Right.
I mean, if you're not focused on sort of giving people what they want, giving donors what they want, is it going to be hard for you to stay in Washington to keep this fight up?
Well, I think the interesting thing is that it may be the opposite of conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom is you have to pass out as much money as you can to as many special interests, get their PAC money, run your campaign, and you win. Well, the conventional interests may be wrong. Look at Chris Christie. He's bold and outspoken, challenges people, and I think he still seems to be popular. He hasn't had to have another election, but I think we'll find out. My prediction is one, I believe in it, but two, I think you can actually tell the truth and get more votes. I think you can be bold and get more people to vote for you.
Hi, Senator. James Polis, PJTV.
Hey.
Back in '96, I was with a bunch of young conservatives at a big DC convention, and the keynote speakers were Trent Lott and Newt Gingrich. All the young conservatives were hopping mad that Congress had not been able to remake Washington in its image overnight. Of course, the Congress then stepped on the gas, and we had the shutdown of the government. Didn't work out so well. How does this Congress find the right tempo, not moving too quickly and not moving too slowly?
Well, I think it's not being trapped into false arguments. For example, shutting down the government and being blamed for it is not a good thing. And I don't want to shut down the government. I don't want them to default. But I also don't want the other side to trap us into an argument where we can't have budgetary reform. It's a great opportunity coming up for us because the mood of the country is with us. The debt problem is enormous. It's a good time for us to say we have to do things differently. We should have a balanced budget amendment. And I won't vote to raise the debt ceiling unless we get a balanced budget amendment, because what will happen is if we put $30 billion associated with raising the debt ceiling, they'll be back in 6 months and they'll be asking for the same thing all over again.
Talk to me quickly about the Patriot Act, which keeps coming up for renewal, and now it's running into some problems. No one's really arguing that it's not useful. Of course, the question that people are raising is whether or not it ought to be perpetual. This is an emergency measure, of course, and now here it is living on and on and on. How do you respond?
I think back to Ben Franklin's response. Those who trade their liberty for security may have neither. I think the Fourth Amendment is as important as the First Amendment. I think you can't protect the First Amendment or the Second Amendment without protecting the Fourth Amendment. I don't like the idea that police officers write warrants. If you go to any local attorney in your community and you ask them, is it a good idea for a policeman to write a warrant without asking a judge, they'll all tell you universally no. But in the last 10 years, we've had 200,000 search warrants written by FBI agents with no judge's signature. We've had 2 million searches of bank records under the suspicious activities reports done without a judge's signature. I think you should have a judge's signature. It's a historic thing. It's one of the reasons we fought the Revolutionary War is because we didn't like what were called general warrants.
Sure.
The soldiers for the British Crown were given a general warrant, and they could come into your house, and they didn't have to have your name. It could be any house, just looking to see if you'd had your documents stamped up for the Stamp Act.
Fran?
Last question. President Obama ran a campaign that really just played on the hopes of young Americans. Now, I think it could be said in his State of the Union address, he really promised young Americans now what they get is a sort of bureaucratic, technocratic life that's beholden to big business, big government. How do Republicans do better for young people?
Well, I think you do have to engage the young people and excite them. There's a lot out there today. I think CPAC's doing a great job of getting young people to come here. And I think you're seeing it on the college campuses. Young people are excited by individual freedom. They may not be in the traditional conservative brand of politics, but they're excited by a smaller government. And I think some of them are excited by a message that isn't so one-sided to say we're going to cut those off of welfare, but we're not going to do anything about corporate welfare. You know, the old Republican politics that it looks like Republicans are only for business and they're against the working class, that doesn't turn on young people either. But when you tell a young person, really nobody gets a free lunch, the rich people or those aren't working, it's, if anything, it's very temporary and we can't have a permanent state of welfare.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Okay.